Seems like Christmas was yesterday. Then next Sunday will be Palm Sunday, and the next Sunday will be Easter. And so I thought as we come up upon the Palm Sunday and Easter season, it would be good to just go through the foundation of Christianity. And the foundation of Christianity is not an idea, it's not a doctrine, it's not beliefs, it's not the Bible. The foundation of Christianity is a man named Jesus. That is the bedrock of Christianity. Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago. Who he was, what he did, what happened to him, and what he said about the future is the bedrock of Christianity. And today I thought it would be good, as we're approaching Palm Sunday and Easter season, to do a quick run-through about Jesus. I am guilty sometimes of thinking, that, I was in seminary for 4 years, and I've done a lot of studying after that on my own, and I've been guilty of thinking that everybody knows as much about the Bible as I do. And sometimes I was talking to somebody the other day, and this issue came up about the second coming of Jesus, and this guy never heard of it. So, I get to where in my life I don't assume, anything anymore. So, I thought it would be good today to do a quick run-through about Jesus. Now, we know about Jesus from the Gospels. Those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. No historical records exist of Jesus that have survived. The only way we know about Jesus is through the Gospels. And we know from the Gospels that Jesus was born in a town called Bethlehem. His mother was a woman named Mary. And we hear that Mary was engaged to a man named Joseph. She became pregnant, but it wasn't by Joseph. She became pregnant by the power of God. And we are told that Jesus is God becoming a human being. That's what Christianity says Jesus was. The technical term for that is incarnation. If you've ever heard the incarnation, to incarnate means to take flesh, to become a human being. And so in Jesus, we see God take on flesh and become a human being. Now, Christianity says that Jesus was a human being in every way just like us. He was not a superhuman. He was like us. But he was also God becoming a human being. And so the way Christian theology has expressed that is to say that Jesus was 100% human and 100% divine. Now that doesn't sound like it makes sense, because we'd think it would be 50% human and 50% divine, but that's not how Christian theology expresses it. Christian theology expresses that Jesus was 100% human, and that just means that he was a person in every way just like us. But he was also, at the same time, 100% God. In other words, when Jesus came here and when God came here and became a human being just like us, he did not cease to be God. And that is the great mystery of Christianity. How could that happen? We cannot just explain that. We don't understand it. But that's what Christianity hinges on. That in Jesus we see 100% man and 100% God. And so Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but the Gospels tell us he grew up in a town called Nazareth. Nazareth was an area in Galilee. And as we've talked about here before, Galilee was not the land of the Jews. The land of the Jews was called Judah, or as it is sometimes called Judea. That's where Jerusalem was. It's down here. North of there is Samaria. In the middle part of the Old Testament, the land of Samaria was known as the land of Israel. And when the land of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in the 700s BC, all those people living there just drop out of the Old Testament and never mentioned again. And we hear about them again when we get to the New Testament. They are known as the Samaritans. Galilee was north of Samaria. It was a place where lots of different ethnic groups lived. There were some Jews living there. It was not a Jewish land, but there were some Jews living there. The Jews down in Judah did not consider those Jews, though, to be real Jews. It's just like, if you're a Baptist, you may not consider a Catholic to be a real Christian. And so that's the way it was in Judaism and all that then. Now, we do not know anything about Jesus' childhood except for one episode that is reported. It says when Jesus was 12 years old, he went with Mary and Joseph to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and they traveled with a large group of people. When they got ready to leave, the group left, and Mary and Joseph assumed Jesus was with the group, but then as time went on, they figured out he was not. So they went back to Jerusalem looking for him, and they found him at the temple, and it says he was sitting among the teachers of the law and asking them questions, and it says that they were amazed at his understanding. Now, after that point, we hear nothing about Jesus again until he is about 30 years old, and he comes on the scene and he is baptized by a man named John the Baptist. And then Jesus begins what is called his public ministry, and that is a time period which biblical scholars believe to be about 3 years, where Jesus travels around Galilee, teaching and healing people. Now, we do not know what Jesus did before that. We do know that it tells us that his occupation was that he was a carpenter, but we do not know anything about his life before that, his adult life before that. We also do not know if this traveling around healing and teaching people was a full-time thing, or whether Jesus just did it occasionally. Maybe he'd go out for a few days and come back home, go out for a few days and come back home. We just do not know. There is a passage in the New Testament that indicates that where Jesus lived when he was an adult was the town of Capernaum, but he grew up in Nazareth. Now, as we talked about last week, Jesus chose 12 disciples to be his core group of followers, and we found that a disciple is like a student attached to a teacher. We also know that there were many more than these 12 disciples that followed Jesus around, but this was the core group. Now, Jesus' main reputation, according to the Gospels, was as a healer. He healed people of real sickness and real disease. He did not use medicine. He was not a doctor. He healed by power coming out of him. There is an episode in the Gospels where a woman comes up behind Jesus and touches the hem of his garment, and she is healed, and although there's a crowd around him, and he doesn't realize that woman's back there, he asked, "Who touched me?" because he said he felt power going out of him. And so he healed by power going out of him. Now, the healings themselves, if you look at them, are interesting. Sometimes Jesus touches a person when he heals them. Other times he does not. Sometimes he can heal people from a distance. There is an episode where somebody came on Jesus to go heal, and they said, "Go home, he's healed," and the man went home and he was healed. So Jesus does not have to touch them. And as we saw earlier with Jesus, the woman that touched his garment got healed. He does not necessarily have to intentionally heal somebody. I want to emphasize, these are healings of real sickness and disease. Now, there used to be, and maybe in some churches now, this healing movement that got started back years ago. It's maybe 20 years ago or something, and people started having healing services. Well, they were doing what was called spiritual healing. It wasn't like, the people on TV that healed people of cancer and all. It was just, healing. And they talked about healing in a spiritual sense. But the reality of it is there is nowhere in the gospel, and I mean nowhere, where it ever talks about Jesus doing spiritual healing. Jesus healed people of real sickness and disease. Sometimes Jesus heals people by casting demons out of them. In fact, casting demons out of people is the miracle in the Bible that Jesus does most often. And that's something we normally don't think of. But casting demons out of people is the single miracle Jesus does most often. Jesus does other kinds of miracles too. He walks on water. He commands storms to cease. He takes a small amount of food and feeds thousands of people. He raises at least 3 people from the dead. And all these miracles, the things that Jesus did, it amazes people. In fact, it goes farther than amazing people. The Gospels tell us that people are so amazed by this that it frightens them. It frightens them to see someone wield that kind of power. Jesus' secondary reputation was as a teacher. People are amazed at his teaching. And the Gospels tell us that Jesus' teaching was different than the teaching of the Jewish leaders, and it says because he spoke with authority, that word meaning competence and mastery of a subject. Jesus teaches many things that go against Judaism and against Jewish law, and for this reason the Jewish leaders oppose him. We see this from early on. It's early on in the Gospel of Mark when we see just a couple of sentences there. The Jewish leaders are talking among themselves, and they withdraw to try to figure out some way that they can destroy him. Now, the Jewish leaders soon, though, come from out of the background and oppose Jesus openly. In fact, they are so opposed to him that they are trying constantly to find some way to trap him so they can get him in trouble with the authorities. Jesus is opposed to the Jewish leaders too. He constantly criticizes them. He calls them hypocrites, calls them sons of Satan, tells them they do not know God, and tells them that their father is the devil. And so here Jesus goes on. This lasts for somewhere around 3 years, traveling around Galilee, teaching and healing, and he becomes immensely popular with people. His reputation precedes him, and it gets to the point where he draws huge crowds, throngs of people. Wherever he goes, he draws huge crowds, and he is more and more popular. As this happens, the Jewish leaders get more and more determined to get rid of him. Now, for some reason, Jesus decides to go to Jerusalem. The Gospels do not tell us why he decides that, but it just simply says that he decides to go to Jerusalem. And so he sets out, accompanied by the 12 disciples and accompanied by some of his other followers. Now, that would have been a distance of a little over 100 miles. And remember, it's done on foot, and my calculations is it would take 38 hours of solid walking if you're a good walker. It'd take me 38 days, probably. But Jesus didn't walk non-stop. We see him traveling to Jerusalem, stopping at places along the way and doing exactly what he was doing in Galilee, healing and teaching. Along the way, his reputation precedes him, and everywhere he goes, throngs of people come out to see him. He also adds more followers along the way who go along with him. And eventually, Jesus and this group of people with him reached Jerusalem, and just as had happened in all the other towns along the way, people heard he was coming, and they came out to greet him. This is what is commemorated on Palm Sunday. We commemorate how people came to greet Jesus when he came to Jerusalem. And people were overjoyed that Jesus was in Jerusalem, with the exception of one group, the Jewish leaders. Just as they had been in all the places beforehand, they were opposed to Jesus. He was teaching things that went against Jewish law, went against everything they had ever been taught about God. And just as happened in other places too, Jesus was against the Jewish leaders. In just a few days, the opposition of the Jewish leaders reached the fever point, and they arranged with one of Jesus' disciples, a man named Judas Iscariot, to lead them to Jesus at a time when they could get their hands on him in secret. It says that they were afraid to just grab him in front of people because everybody loved him so much they were afraid of creating a brawl or something if they tried to get him in front of people. So they wanted to get him at a time when nobody else was around. And so Judas leads them to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. They place Jesus under arrest, and the disciples who were with Jesus run off. And Jesus was taken before the Jewish leaders, and they questioned him. From his answers, they were sure that he was against God. He was teaching and proclaiming things about God that, according to everything they had always heard about God, were dead wrong. And they believed this to the point where they believed Jesus was deserving of death. The problem, though, was that they didn't have the authority to put somebody to death, but only the Romans could do that. So they took Jesus before Pilate, made accusations against him, and wanted Pilate to sentence Jesus to death. Pilate, however, could find nothing Jesus had done wrong, and he told the Jewish leaders that. They were insistent and kept pressuring him. Pilate refused. But then the Jewish leaders stirred up the crowd and tried to get the crowd to demand that Jesus be killed. And so Pilate consented just to keep the peace. He was afraid of a mob. And so he handed Jesus over to be crucified, and Jesus was placed on the cross and killed. Now after he died, a man named Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and requested the body. He took the body of Jesus down from the cross and wrapped it in a cloth and laid it in a new tomb. And this was on Friday afternoon. The next day was Saturday. That was the Sabbath day in Judaism. And we do not know what the disciples and the other followers of Jesus did Friday after the crucifixion, or Saturday at all. We don't know what they did. But we know that on Sunday morning, a group of women got up early and went to the tomb, taking spices to put on the body of Jesus. There was no embalming back then. They simply put a body in a tomb, and these were hewn out of rock, and they put it in there until it rotted away. And you can imagine it could stink, so they put spices on the body to sort of mask the odor of the body stinking. And here go these women to do that, and when they get there, they find the stone is rolled away from the tomb, and the tomb is empty. Spiritual beings appear to them and tell them that Jesus has risen from the dead, and they tell them to go tell the disciples. So they do. Nobody believes them. So the disciples go to the tomb themselves and find it just as the women had said. And then, of course, after that, Jesus himself appears to people. He appears a number of times to the disciples. He appears to others of his followers. It says that he appeared to 500 people after he resurrected from the grave. He had the wounds from his crucifixion still on his body. It was a real body. They could touch him. We see Jesus eating food. And so we know that this was not a spirit or a ghost. It was a real human body. Jesus remained on earth 40 days after his resurrection, where, as I said, he appeared to about 500 people. Then one day he was out with some of the disciples, and he ascended into heaven. It says that a cloud took him up into heaven, and spiritual beings appeared to those disciples who witnessed it and told them that one day Jesus would return from the sky. Now, it's important to note that Jesus ascended into heaven in a human body. That is something that a lot of times people don't think of. It wasn't that Jesus' spirit ascended into heaven. The Bible is very careful to make sure we know that when Jesus rose from the dead, it was in a human body, just like ours. And it's in that same human body that he ascended into heaven. Classical Christian theology is based on that. You cannot have Christianity without that. So then, after Jesus ascended into heaven, we are told that the disciples started spreading the message of Jesus. The book of Acts in the New Testament records some of what they did. And I think the most important thing to take away from that is that it tells us what they proclaimed. They proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus, and they proclaimed the resurrection of the dead. And I think that is important to know that the emphasis of the first Christian preaching that we know of was the resurrection of the dead. Now, we do not know what the other followers of Jesus did after his ascension, but from things that survive in the historical record, we know that there were followers of Jesus other than the disciples after his ascension, and that they were active in some ways after his ascension. Now, after a short time in the book of Acts, we see Christianity become a religion. We see the Jews reject the message of Jesus. We see the disciples of Jesus drop out of the picture. And we see Christianity spreading to people who are not Jews. And Christianity becomes a totally separate religion than Judaism. Now, it's important to realize that Christianity is not based on what people sit down and follow. It's not even based on an apparition. Remember, we've talked in here before about Mormonism and how it was based on an apparition that appeared to Joseph Smith, and he dug up some books. And Islam is based on some angel coming to Muhammad and dictating the book to him. And so, but Christianity is not based on anything like that. It's based on a person, a real historical person, what happened to Jesus. Christianity then is based on a historical event, something that really happened. And so I want you to keep in mind that the basis of Christianity is an historical event. It's not something people sit down and thought of, but it is something that happened. And it is the event of the life of the man Jesus.